April 27, 2024. A gold pocket watch is placed beneath the auction lights. The bidding climbs rapidly. Then it stops at more than 1 million British pounds. 3 letters engraved on the case, JJA, are not enough to tell the story behind it. But they once belonged to a man who, throughout his life, had never been made to wait for anything. That watch stopped more than a century ago. On the night of April 15, 1912, after its owner took the hand of his pregnant wife, placed her into a lifeboat, and stepped back. He asked a very simple question. "May I go with my wife?" The answer came immediately. No. Not because of a lack of money. Not because there was no space, but because there are rules that even the richest man cannot cross. A watch. A man. A single moment in which all power collapsed. If money can buy everything, why did this man die on the deck of the Titanic? This is not only a disaster, it is a larger story about power, society, and the price paid when people believe they cannot be refused. If you want to know what led this man to that moment, like the video and subscribe to the channel to follow the stories that come next. Because to understand why he was told no that night, we must return to the past, to the place where money first became power, and where power began to create illusion. In 1763, in the village of Waldorf near Heidelberg, in what was then a poor rural region of Germany, Johann Jacob Astor was born. The area had been shaped by war, taxation, and economic instability throughout the 18th century. His father worked as a butcher, a trade that provided stability, but offered no land, no accumulated capital, and no path of social advancement for the next generation. The Astor family was not destitute, but they belonged to a class whose future in Europe was largely predetermined. They owned no land to inherit, they had no capital to invest, and they held no social position that could open doors beyond manual labor. By the late 18th century, in much of Europe, birth largely determined destiny. A child born into a working family would almost certainly remain there for life. Johann Jacob Astor understood this early. If he stayed in Waldorf, he would inherit his father's trade, and little else. At the age of 16, Astor left home for London to live with his brother. London was then the commercial center of the British Empire, where goods from North America, India, the Caribbean, and Asia converged. Astor became involved in the manufacture and sale of musical instruments, primarily flutes. It was honest work, but it offered low margins and limited scalability. He earned money, but he saw no future. Surrounded by global trade, Astor remained at the margins of the system, selling small goods that could not be expanded into power. In 1784, Astor left London and crossed the Atlantic to New York. The United States had been independent for less than a decade. New York was still a modest port city, with a population under 40,000, but it was a society not yet rigidly locked by birth. The voyage lasted several weeks, and it was aboard that ship that Astor met a fur trader. The man spoke of beaver pelts in Europe. In the 18th century, beaver felt hats were a marker of status. The aristocracy and upper classes were willing to pay high prices for them. A single high-quality pelt could sell for several times the monthly wages of a European laborer. Astor did not hear an anecdote. He saw a system, a stable demand, high profit margins, and a supply located on another continent. When he arrived in New York, Astor did not continue in musical instruments. He sought employment in a fur shop, beginning with the most basic tasks. He learned how pelts were graded, priced, preserved, and shipped. He learned the market from the ground up, expanding slowly and deliberately. His wife, Sarah Todd, managed the shop in New York. Astor traveled farther. He went into upstate New York, meeting hunters and negotiating directly with Native American tribes. Rather than relying on intermediaries, He sought control at the source. Gradually, Astor identified the core principle. Profit did not lie in the final sale. It lay in controlling the entire supply chain, from trapping to transport, from storage to export. In 1794, the Jay Treaty between the United States and Britain was signed. The treaty opened American access to trade in the Great Lakes region, an area previously under British control. This region held the richest fur resources in North America. Many American merchants hesitated, concerned about political instability and security risks. Astor did not. He expanded trading posts, hired his own agents, and acquired ships to move goods independently. By 1808, Astor founded the American Fur Company. It was not merely a business, but an integrated monopoly. Within less than 2 decades, the company controlled most fur trading operations from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest. In 1811, Astor established Fort Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River. It became the first permanent American trading outpost on the Pacific coast. The modern town of Astoria still bears his name. This was not only economic expansion, but territorial influence achieved through commerce. By the 1832, Astor recognized another shift. European fashion moved towards silk hats. Demand for beaver fur declined. Beaver populations in North America were also being depleted through overhunting. Astor exited the industry that had made his fortune, not after its collapse, but as its growth slowed. He redirected his capital into what he believed to be permanent: land. From the late 18th century onward, Astor had quietly been acquiring property in Manhattan. While the city remained concentrated in the South, he purchased land considered too distant and undeveloped to hold value. Astor did not build. He leased land on 21-year contracts. When leases expired, all improvements, houses, shops, and structures reverted to him. While others built, Astor waited. New York's population surged with immigration. The city expanded northward exactly as Astor had anticipated. Land values rose exponentially. By the 1840s, John Jacob Astor had become the wealthiest man in the United States. His fortune was estimated at approximately $20 million at the time, equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars when adjusted for economic scale today. A single individual controlled nearly 1% of the entire national economy. In 1848, Astor died. He left funds to establish the Astor Library, a predecessor of the New York Public Library. But the majority of his wealth, land, and economic power passed to his family. An empire had been built from nothing. Yet money alone was still not enough to buy what the Astors desired most. So what awaited his heirs in New York? And why, despite such extraordinary wealth, were they still not fully accepted at the highest levels of American society? The answer appears with a woman. One who would decide who belonged inside New York society and who would remain outside its doors. In 1830, Caroline Webster Schermerhorn was born in New York into an old Dutch family whose roots stretched back to the era of New Amsterdam. The Schermerhorns belonged to the Knickerbocker class, descendants of the earliest European settlers, a group that existed long before the United States itself. In 19th-century New York, the Knickerbockers were not necessarily the wealthiest families, but they were the ones who decided who qualified as society. Their power did not come from money, but from control over social norms, marriage alliances, etiquette, and recognition. Caroline grew up in a world where power did not need to announce itself. It appeared in guest lists, in seating arrangements, in who was invited into the drawing room and who was never invited at all. From an early age, she learned how to observe and understand these invisible boundaries. In 1853, Caroline married William Backhouse Astor Jr. The marriage did not make the Astor family richer, but it gave them something far more valuable: social legitimacy that money alone could not purchase. The Astor dynasty already dominated Manhattan through land ownership and rents. Yet in the eyes of old New York, they remained new money, descended from a German immigrant fur trader. Caroline became the bridge between these two worlds. William Backhouse Astor Jr. inherited an enormous fortune from his father, including hundreds of properties across Manhattan. Their value increased steadily as the city expanded, but William showed little interest in controlling society. He devoted much of his time to yachting, horse racing, and long absences from New York. That absence created a vacuum of power, and Caroline stepped into it. From the 1860s onward, Caroline began shaping a new social order centered on Fifth Avenue. The mansions rising along the avenue were not merely homes, but markers of status. Caroline understood that by controlling the rituals that governed interaction among those houses, she could control the entire upper class. The dinners and balls she hosted were not loud or extravagant. They were governed by precision. Guest lists were curated carefully. The absence of a name required no explanation, yet everyone understood its meaning. Caroline did not rule through money. She ruled through recognition. By the late 19th century, Caroline formed an alliance with Ward McAllister, a Southern-born lawyer who had reinvented himself as a social theorist and organizer. McAllister understood the mechanics of exclusivity. He believed society was governed not by wealth, but by scarcity. Together, they created a concept that would come to define New York society: the 400. According to McAllister, only about 400 people truly belonged to New York society. The number roughly matched the capacity of the ballroom in Caroline's Fifth Avenue mansion. Whether symbolic or literal, the boundary it created was unmistakable. Thousands of newly wealthy families were placed outside this circle: industrialists in railroads, steel, and oil, men whose fortunes reached tens of millions of dollars by the late 19th century, still failed to receive invitations. There were no rejection letters, only repeated silence. This was the moment when Caroline's power reached its peak. Those she recognized were recognized everywhere. Those she excluded were excluded across the entire social network. Other families planned their social seasons around her calendar. A season was considered a failure if one did not appear in Caroline Astor's ballroom. This authority lasted nearly 40 years. From the aftermath of the Civil War through the early 20th century, no major social event in New York occurred without consideration of her position. The press referred to her simply as the Mrs. Astor. No surname was necessary. There was no one else to confuse her with. Yet absolute social power, like any closed system, carried the seeds of instability. New York continued to grow wealthier. New money poured into the city. Manhattan became the financial center of an industrializing world, and the society Caroline controlled grew increasingly strained under the pressure of change. The first rupture did not come from outside the gate. It came from within the Astor family itself. Caroline's only heir grew up surrounded by these rituals, immersed in this invisible authority, yet felt no attraction to it. He showed little interest in society. He did not seek recognition or control. And here lay the central paradox. The woman who ruled New York society for nearly 4 decades could not rule the one person who would inherit her name. Her only heir was raised inside that world, yet did not belong to it. So what happens when absolute social power is passed to someone who does not want it? And where would this misalignment lead the Astor dynasty? The answer begins with a boy named John Jacob Astor IV. On July 13, 1864, John Jacob Astor IV was born at Ferncliff, the Astor family estate in Rhinebeck, in New York's Hudson Valley. Ferncliff was not merely a residence. It was the center of the family's power, where decisions concerning Manhattan landholdings, rental income, and long-term family strategy were made. Jack was the only son of William Backhouse Astor Jr. and Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. Legally, he was the direct heir to a vast real estate empire spread across New York City. Socially, he was born to inherit the invisible authority his mother had exercised for nearly 4 decades. From an early age, Jack grew up in a world where power did not need to be spoken. Guest lists, positions within a room, and even silence carried meaning. He was taught how to appear at the right moment, say the right words, and understand boundaries that were never explained aloud. But Jack never truly belonged to that system. He was sent to St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, one of the most prestigious boarding schools for the sons of East Coast elites. The institution was designed to train future politicians, financiers, and social leaders. Jack later continued his education at Harvard University, where social networks were often as valuable as academic knowledge. While many of his classmates built relationships and alliances, Jack gravitated toward laboratories, mechanical workshops, and technical drawings. Contemporary accounts describe him as quiet, reserved, and socially awkward in large gatherings. He lacked neither intelligence nor education, but he was uncomfortable with the unspoken social codes his mother mastered so completely. This misalignment was not insignificant. Within the Astor family, society was not merely conversation, it was power. In 1891, Jack Astor married Ava Lowell Willing. Ava came from one of Philadelphia's most respected and established families. Her ancestor Thomas Willing had served as president of the First Bank of the United States, a central financial institution in the nation's early years. The Willing family represented a form of traditional financial authority, discreet, stable, and deeply rooted. Socially, the marriage was considered ideal. It united New York real estate power with Philadelphia financial influence, 2 pillars of the East Coast elite. The union strengthened the Astor family's standing within the traditional power network. But the balance existed only on paper. Ava was sharp, articulate, and comfortable in social settings. Jack was not. He increasingly withdrew from gatherings where his wife thrived. The contrast between them slowly became a quiet distance, even as appearances remained proper. In 1894, Jack Astor did something that left New York society unsure how to respond. He published a science fiction novel titled A Journey in Other Worlds. Set in the year 2000, the book imagined a world of interplanetary travel, climate change driven by industrial activity, and technological systems replacing older social structures. For readers of the time, it was not casual entertainment. It was a bold vision of the future, written by a man society expected to live entirely within the present order of power. An Astor heir was born to manage land, wealth, and society, not to speculate about a century yet to come. The upper class did not openly criticize the book. They simply did not know where to place Jack Astor anymore. The novel was not a passing hobby. It revealed how Jack understood the world as a collection of systems that could be designed, repaired, and improved. Soon afterward, he began registering a series of mechanical patents. These included improvements to bicycle brakes, road construction devices, and experimental mechanisms intended to generate energy. None of these inventions brought him fame or great profit, but they showed that Jack sought value in logic, structure, and function rather than social recognition. And this is where the story turns. In 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out. For the first time, the United States entered a conflict with imperial reach, centered on Cuba and the Philippines. For most of the upper class, war was something to support with money and speeches. Jack Astor did not choose that path. He personally financed and equipped an entire volunteer artillery unit, providing guns, uniforms, and logistical support. The unit later became known as the Astor Battery. But signing checks was still not enough. Jack applied to join the Army himself. He was appointed lieutenant colonel in the United States Volunteers and deployed to Cuba. There, American forces faced not only the enemy but also malaria, dysentery, supply shortages, and a brutal tropical climate. More soldiers died from disease than from combat. In that environment, background meant nothing. No one cared who Jack Astor's parents were, or how much Manhattan real estate he owned. There were no drawing rooms, no guest lists, no silent judgments. There were only orders to be carried out, responsibilities to be borne, and results by which competence was measured. Jack Astor functioned well within that system. Military discipline replaced the vague social rules he had never understood. The clarity of rank was easier to navigate than the silent nods of the ballroom. Worth was measured by action, not approval. After the war, Jack Astor was promoted to the rank of colonel. It was the only title in his life not inherited. From that point forward, he preferred to be addressed as Colonel Astor, because it was a status he had earned for himself. But the Army provided only a temporary structure. It did not resolve the central conflict. Upon returning to New York, Jack Astor remained the sole heir to a society controlled by his own mother, a society governed by unspoken rules, with no place for those unwilling or unable to play their assigned role. If Jack Astor could not prove his value within society, and could not escape it either, what choice remained? And where would that choice ultimately lead him? By the late 19th century, New York was changing faster than any other city in America. New money was pouring in from steel, railroads, and oil. Families who had become wealthy within a single generation were buying land, building grand mansions, and demanding entry into the old social elite. But in Manhattan, there was something even harder to purchase than land recognition. Caroline Astor had built an entire mechanism to control it. She did not need orders. She only needed silence. If you were not invited, you understood you had been excluded. And within the Astor family itself, a quiet power struggle had been unfolding for years. Not between the rich and the poor, but between people equally wealthy competing for authority. William Waldorf Astor was Jack Astor's cousin. By genealogical logic, he had a legitimate claim. He belonged to the senior male line of the family. In traditional family hierarchy, the senior branch was often regarded as the rightful symbolic head, but society did not operate on genealogy. Caroline Astor held the invisible crown of New York society. She was Mrs. Astor not merely by name, but by social authority. The title itself was power. William Waldorf wanted his wife to be recognized as Mrs. Astor, in that sense, a declaration that his branch, not Caroline's, stood at the center of the family. Caroline refused, and because she refused, New York society refused as well. There was no courtroom battle. The weapon chosen was something else: architecture. In 1893, William Waldorf Astor demolished his father's mansion at 5th Avenue and 33rd Street and replaced it with a massive hotel. He named it the Waldorf Hotel. This was not simply a business venture. It was a calculated provocation. The Waldorf rose directly beside Caroline Astor's residence. A space once defined by controlled, quiet, and private authority was suddenly flooded with carriage traffic, strangers, electric light, and commerce. For a woman whose power relied on subtle control, this was humiliation disguised as investment. But Jack Astor saw something else. He saw a fracture in his mother's system of power. Caroline's drawing room operated by invitation and exclusion. If you were invited, you existed. If not, you had no stage. A hotel worked differently. A hotel was public space with order. No invitation was required to enter the lobby, but once inside, presence became unavoidable. The space itself generated a new form of authority, the authority of visibility. And this is where the story turns. In 1897, Jack Astor responded with a move even stronger in symbolism. He demolished his mother's former home and constructed the Astoria Hotel directly beside the Waldorf. If the Waldorf was William Waldorf Astor's provocation, the Astoria was Jack Astor's seizure of the stage. The two hotels were connected by a long corridor. New York journalists gave it a name: Peacock Alley. The name did not come from the owners. It came from observation. The wealthy paraded through the corridor in their finest clothing, displaying status, watching and being watched. Like peacocks, they showed their feathers. The hallway became a runway. What mattered was this: Peacock Alley created a form of social power Caroline Astor could no longer control with guest lists. This was no longer her drawing room. It was a space Jack Astor had built, where society functioned through presence and spectacle. The Waldorf and Astoria merged into the Waldorf Astoria, becoming the most famous and luxurious hotel in New York. Major political figures, foreign dignitaries, and international financiers stayed there. Events that once belonged exclusively to private mansions now took place in Astor's space. Jack Astor did not ask for a place in society. He created a place society was forced to occupy. But symbolism was not enough. He wanted something beyond ritual. In 1904, he opened the St. Regis Hotel at 5th Avenue and 55th Street. The St. Regis was not merely a place to sleep. It was designed as a residence powered by systems. This was where Jack's engineering mind took control. He was obsessed with turning comfort into standardization. Every room had electricity, a private bathroom, and telephone access, unprecedented in New York at the time. Guests were not simply accommodated. They were placed inside a machine designed for elite living. Jack Astor was not selling rooms. He was selling a modern way of life. Then, in 1906, he moved the story onto an entirely new stage. The Knickerbocker Hotel opened at Times Square. At the time, Times Square was still in transition, not yet the cultural center it would become, but Jack Astor saw the direction of the city before others did. The Knickerbocker quickly became a gathering place for theater figures, journalists, and public personalities. A different kind of power emerged there: louder, more visible, more modern. Across 4 dates, 1893, 1897, 1904, and 1906. Jack Astor accomplished something precise. He relocated social power from private drawing rooms into public spaces he owned and controlled. But power built from architecture comes at a cost. As his hotels reached perfection, his marriage to Ava Lowell Willing quietly collapsed. Long absences, separate lives. Two people occupying the same world, but no longer the same space. Jack Astor built places where others belonged, yet in his own home, he belonged nowhere. So what happens when the man who reshaped New York's social geography cannot hold together his own family? And how would that collapse open the door to the decision that would truly enrage New York society in the chapter to come? In 1891, John Jacob Astor IV entered a marriage that New York society considered predetermined, not by love, but by logic. Ava Lowell Willing did not come from Manhattan. She came from Philadelphia, an older center of American power, where elite families were accustomed to standing behind the nation's financial and political systems rather than proving their status in drawing rooms. The Willing family required no long introduction within elite circles. The name Thomas Willing alone, a man who once served as the first president of the Bank of the United States, was enough to define the kind of authority this family possessed. It was power rooted in history, not display. With this marriage, Jack Astor did not climb higher in society. He simply stepped into the position society had already reserved for him. But a perfect structure does not guarantee harmony. Jack Astor had grown up under the weight of expectation, yet never truly belonged to the social world his mother controlled. He was quiet, inward-looking, accustomed to thinking in systems and mechanisms. Ava was the opposite. Sharp, commanding, and comfortable at the center of attention, she thrived on presence and response. The marriage placed two incompatible forms of energy into the same space. By the end of 1891, only months after the wedding, Ava gave birth to their first son, Vincent. The child became the direct heir to the Astor fortune before his first birthday. On paper, the family was complete. In private, distance was already forming. At social gatherings, Ava shone. Jack often remained on the margins. Later social accounts suggest that Ava did not hide her impatience with her husband, sometimes expressing it openly through sharp remarks. These accounts were never officially confirmed, but their repetition across memoirs and recollections reflected a reality that many around them recognized. And then Ava left. In 1896, she moved to London, not as an extended visit, but to establish a life of her own. London at the time was the center of international high society. There, Ava was no longer simply Mrs. Astor. She was herself. She appeared at major social events and moved easily among European aristocracy and financiers, in circles where American wealth did not automatically dominate the conversation. Jack Astor remained in the United States. He built hotels. He invested. He expanded his public influence while his private life quietly emptied. Geographical distance became something more permanent. In 1902, Ava gave birth to their daughter, Ava Alice. The child arrived more than a decade after Vincent. The gap required no explanation. It reflected a marriage that existed largely in name, sustained by obligation and position rather than shared life. From 1896 to 1909, Ava lived almost entirely in Europe. Jack and Ava occupied the same social world, but not the same space, not the same rhythm, not the same purpose. During this period, rumors began to circulate. Whispers in London and New York, society spoke of Ava's private relationships, involving figures familiar to international high society. There were no confirmations, no public denials, only prolonged silence. Jack Astor did not respond publicly. He did not confront. He did not dramatize. He continued building structures outward, while the structure of his family quietly collapsed. Then, in 1909, Ava returned to the United States, not to reconcile, but to end it. Between 1909 and 1910, Ava Willing formally filed for divorce. In elite society at the time, divorce was never merely personal. It was a public fracture. The decision was finalized. Vincent, the eldest son, remained with his father. Ava Alice, the younger daughter, went with her mother to Europe. The Astor family was split in two, and soon after, another pillar disappeared. In 1910, Caroline Astor died. The woman who had controlled New York society for nearly 40 years exited the stage. Jack Astor was 45 years old. Within less than a year, he had lost his mother, his family, and the social structure that had defined his life, even if he had never truly belonged to it. He became the head of the Astor family in name, but without anyone left to hold the rhythm of the world around him. There was no collapse, no public despair, only emptiness. Jack Astor was not searching for rebellion. He was not seeking revenge. He was searching for a presence close enough to fill the space that power and wealth could not reach. And at the moment when Jack Astor was most empty, During a summer retreat where high society gathered, a 17-year-old girl entered his life. Her name was Madeleine Force, and from that moment on, every rule New York society had built began to be tested. In the summer of 1910, at Bar Harbor, Maine, the East Coast elite returned to their familiar routine: large wooden houses facing the Atlantic, afternoon sailing, and conversations where every glance carried weight. It was here that a rumor began to spread, faster than the tide. John Jacob Astor IV was being seen in the company of a young girl, not in ballrooms, not in public ceremonies, but in spaces private enough to attract attention. Her name was Madeleine Force. When they met, Jack Astor was 46 years old. Madeleine was 17. That alone was enough to shock. But the true disturbance lay elsewhere. Madeleine Force did not come from the 400. Her family was comfortable, but not part of the social network Caroline Astor had once constructed and controlled. Her father, William H. Force, was a successful shipping businessman, wealthy through commerce and labor rather than inherited social authority. In that world, money was a necessary condition, but it had never been sufficient. Madeleine had just graduated from Miss Spence's school, an elite girls' school in Manhattan. Institutions like Spence trained young women to become proper wives. They taught presence. They taught restraint. They taught how to stand beside the right man. What they did not teach was how to survive at the center of a social crisis. Jack Astor began inviting Madeleine on walks, short drives, private boat rides along the bay. There were no public declarations, no formal explanations, and it was precisely this silence that unsettled society. This was not a relationship introduced through proper channels. It did not pass through the approval of the 400. There was no Caroline Astor left to legitimize it. By late 1910 and early 1911, New York newspapers began to follow every appearance closely. But the question they asked was not about love. They asked about order. 3 factors triggered outrage simultaneously. First, Jack Astor was a divorced man. Within American high society at the time, divorce still carried moral stigma, especially when followed by remarriage outside accepted norms. Second, Madeleine was younger than his own son. Vincent Astor was already 19. This age gap did more than provoke discomfort. It created a structural paradox within the Astor family itself. Third, and most crucially, Caroline Astor was dead. The woman who had once decided who could enter New York society was gone. There was no social guarantor, no mechanism of control. What Jack Astor was doing was the first major Astor decision made entirely outside the traditional social filter. On August 1, 1911, William Force confirmed to the press that his daughter was engaged to John Jacob Astor IV. At that moment, society stopped whispering. Editorials flooded the papers. Clergy spoke from their pulpits. Families that had remained silent now publicly condemned the engagement. No one asked what Madeleine wanted. They asked who she thought she was. Some newspapers portrayed her as a fortune seeker. Others framed the engagement as evidence of moral decay among the newly wealthy. But all agreed on one point. This marriage was not supposed to happen, and Madeleine Force became the focus of collective punishment. She received anonymous letters, threats, warnings vague but frightening enough for a 17-year-old girl. Later accounts suggest Madeleine suffered severe emotional distress, insomnia, and prolonged anxiety, requiring medical attention. This was no longer social disapproval. It was a coordinated effort to force her disappearance. Jack Astor did not respond publicly. He did not debate the press. He did not attempt to negotiate public opinion. He chose the only response he believed would work, he continued. And this is where the story truly turns. New York society could ostracize a young woman, but they did not anticipate that the man who had once built spaces for society itself would be willing to stand outside it, despite the pressure. Despite the refusal of prestigious churches to officiate, despite the absence of anyone willing to shield the family name, the marriage would still take place. The question was no longer whether they would marry. It was how far they would have to leave their old world behind to do it. And that decision would place John Jacob Astor IV and Madeline Force on a path with no return. The answer lies in the next chapter. In August 1911, John Jacob Astor IV began a task that should have been simple: finding a minister to officiate his wedding. From the very first step, every door closed. Astor approached the Episcopal Church, the institution most closely associated with America's upper class. This was the church of old families, of tradition, of rituals that required no explanation. The response came quickly: refusal. There was no official statement, no reason put into writing. Only the cold silence of a system that understood perfectly well what was not supposed to happen. Astor continued, turning to other denominations. One church after another. The answer never changed: refusal. The problem was not the ceremony. It was the precedent. A public wedding of this kind would establish a new norm, and no religious institution was willing to put its name on that rupture. While Astor searched for a minister, the press followed every move. Each meeting was observed, each rumor magnified. Newspapers no longer asked when the wedding would take place. They asked who would dare to perform it. And with each passing day, the answer became clearer: no one. By then, Astor understood. The issue was not finding someone willing. It was finding someone willing to pay the price. Eventually, one name emerged: Joseph Lambert. Lambert did not belong to the social elite. He did not represent a major congregation. He did not possess a social standing that required protection. That was precisely why he became the only option. On September 9, 1911, the wedding took place at Beechwood, Newport. Not in New York. Not at the center of power, but in a location distant enough that society did not have to witness it directly. The guest list was so small it drew attention. None of the prominent families of the 400 were present. None of the familiar faces from Manhattan's drawing rooms appeared. The flowers chosen were American beauty roses, a symbol of luxury, but also of the very extravagant society was now trying to avoid acknowledging. One detail unsettled many observers. Vincent Astor, Jack's 19-year-old son, stood as best man for his father, an image difficult to reconcile within traditional family order, the heir standing beside a marriage society deemed improper. There was no thunderous applause, no public congratulations, only a ceremony completed quickly, but the cost did not end there. Immediately after the wedding, Joseph Lambert came under intense pressure, unofficial reprimands, implicit warnings from higher authorities. No formal punishment was ever announced. Yet Lambert was forced to leave his congregation. A wedding had taken place, but no one wished to admit they had stood close to it. John Jacob Astor IV and Madeline Force were husband and wife on paper, but socially, they were left without a place. And this is where the story turns once again. If New York would not accept them, then the world beyond would. The question was no longer how American society would treat them. It was where John Jacob Astor would take his wife to begin anew. And that choice would place them aboard the most famous ship in the world. The answer lies in the next chapter. By the end of 1911, John Jacob Astor IV and Madeline left the United States. Not as travelers seeking leisure, but as people deliberately removing themselves from a system that had just rejected them. There was no farewell, no society standing behind them, only a carefully calculated departure. Astor chose to begin aboard the yacht Noma. Noma was not merely a private vessel. It was a mobile space of power, where Astor controlled every variable: who was allowed aboard, who could approach Madeline, and what information could escape into the outside world. On Noma, they were no longer headlines, no longer a scandal, just a wealthy man and his young wife drifting beyond reach. Their first stop was Bermuda. In the early 20th century, Bermuda functioned as a social buffer for America's elite, close enough to avoid exile, distant enough to escape New York's direct scrutiny. Here, Madeline stepped into public view without immediate judgment. No questions about her age, no references to Caroline Astor, no mention of the 400. But Astor did not stop there. He understood that to truly escape the old system, they had to leave its entire social hemisphere behind. In January 1912, they boarded Olympic to cross the Atlantic. Olympic was more than a ship. It embodied the greatest belief of the age, the belief that modern engineering could eliminate risk. Olympic and Titanic were two of the three vessels in the Olympic class, the largest ships ever built. They represented an era convinced that steel, engines, and calculation had finally conquered the ocean. The crossing was smooth. No incident. No disturbance. This only reinforced Astor's confidence that everything remained under control. In Europe, they did not linger in traditional social capitals. They continued on to Egypt. Traveling to Egypt in the early 20th century was not tourism. It was a privilege reserved for those who believed history, geography, and time itself were accessible through wealth. It was during this journey that they encountered Margaret Brown. Brown did not belong to New York's old social elite. She was newly wealthy through industry, outspoken, independent, and unconcerned with the unspoken rules of the 400. At the time, the meeting meant little, but it quietly linked individuals who would later share a moment no one could have anticipated. From Egypt, Astor and Madeline traveled to Paris. Paris was a place beyond American social control. Their past required no explanation. No approval was necessary. They were simply who they were. Within this space, Madeline began to recover, and it was here that a new reality emerged. In early 1912, Madeline became pregnant. The news was not made public, but for Astor, it changed everything. The child had to be born on American soil, not for sentiment, but for legal standing, inheritance, and the future position of the Astor line. Astor did not hesitate. He decided to return. But not aboard just any ship. He would return on the newest, largest, and most celebrated vessel the world could offer. A ship advertised as nearly unsinkable, a perfect symbol of the belief that had guided Astor his entire life, that with enough money, preparation, and technology, all risks could be controlled. Astor did not know that the most rational decision by the logic of his era would place him closer to fate than ever before. They chose the finest ship in the world to return home, and that was the moment fate intervened. The question was no longer how they would return to America, but whether the world would allow them to complete the journey. The answer awaited them aboard a ship called Titanic. On April 10, 1912, Titanic departed from Southampton. This was not merely a transatlantic crossing. It was a public demonstration of power by an entire era. Titanic was the largest ship ever built, nearly 270 meters long, displacing over 46,000 tons, driven by 3 massive propellers. Powered by a combined system of reciprocating engines and a central turbine, the most advanced propulsion technology of its time, Newspapers described her as a marvel of modern engineering. Some used the phrase, practically unsinkable. No one called it arrogance. They called it progress. That same day, in Cherbourg, France, John Jacob Astor IV boarded the ship. There was no spectacle, no public display. He traveled with his pregnant wife, Madeleine Astor, 5 months along, accompanied by a small private entourage including servants, a personal nurse, and his Airedale terrier, Kitty. Astor reserved one of the finest accommodations on board. Suites C62 through C64, located on C deck on the starboard side. This was not a standard stateroom. It was a floating residence, a private sitting room, a spacious bedroom, a private bathroom, still a rarity in 1912, and access to an enclosed promenade deck, allowing Madeleine to take in the sea air without appearing in public view. Astor chose this location deliberately. He disliked being watched, and he believed that aboard this ship, every variable could be controlled. After leaving Cherbourg, Titanic stopped briefly at Queenstown, Ireland on April 11. Then the Atlantic opened ahead. The first days passed calmly. Madeleine spent most of her time resting in their suite. Astor did not. He observed the ship not as a passenger but as an engineer. He asked officers about the hull structure, about the watertight compartments, about impact resistance. Astor was not a man who trusted slogans. He trusted systems. And Titanic, in his mind, was a system designed not to fail. On April 14, 1912, Titanic received multiple ice warnings from nearby ships, wireless messages sent via the Marconi system, ice fields, large bergs, rapidly dropping water temperatures. This was not hidden information, nor was it unexpected. Yet Titanic maintained her speed. That night, the ocean was unnaturally calm. No wind, no waves. The sea lay flat, like black glass. That stillness made everything more dangerous. No waves breaking against ice to reflect light. No natural warning signs. At approximately 11:40 p.m., a faint vibration ran through the hull. Not a violent crash, not an explosion, just a subtle disturbance. Inside his suite, Jack Astor felt it. He did not panic. He did not shout. But he knew enough to stand. He stepped into the corridor, saw a few passengers peering from their cabins, heard hushed questions. No one cried accident. No one said sinking. But Jack Astor understood one thing. The ship had stopped, and a ship designed never to stop could only do so for one serious reason. He went up on deck, watched the lights, observed the strange stillness of the crew. That was the moment the illusion began to fracture. Titanic had not yet sunk, but the belief that everything remained under control had already begun to fail. The question was no longer whether Titanic would sink. It was this: when the rules of man collide with the limits of nature, who pays the price first? And Jack Astor, a man who had spent his life believing every system could be redesigned, was about to confront something no invention could repair. That truth would reveal itself before the night was over. Between approximately 11:45 p.m. and just after midnight, Jack Astor left his suite and made his way toward the bridge. He did not run. He did not panic. He asked Captain Edward Smith one simple question: "Should I wake my wife?" Smith looked at him for a moment, then answered briefly, "Yes, you should wake her." That answer told Jack Astor everything he needed to know. This was no minor technical issue, not a delay, not a precaution. This was preparation for the worst. Astor returned to the suite. He woke Madeleine gently. He did not speak of sinking. He did not speak of danger. He told her they should dress warmly, put on their life belts, and go up on deck as instructed. Madeline was 5 months pregnant. She was tired. She was cold. But she was not afraid. They left the cabin with her maid and private nurse. On deck, the scene was nothing like what people imagine during a disaster. No screaming, no rushing crowds, no chaos, only orderly confusion. Officers uncovering lifeboats, crew members working quietly, the band still playing somewhere in the distance. The cold wind cut through their coats. Madeline began to shiver. Astor looked around and led her into the gymnasium. It was an enclosed space. Less wind. Fewer people. They sat on the metal exercise machines. Life belts secured tightly around them. Time began to stretch unnaturally. Astor remained calm. He took another life belt, used his penknife to cut open the outer fabric. He showed Madeline what was inside. Cork, the material designed to keep a body afloat. Not reassurance through words, but through reality. This is what will keep you alive. While they waited, Madeline noticed a young woman standing nearby. She was holding a newborn baby. The child was wrapped poorly, his skin turning blue from the cold. She was Leah UX, a third-class passenger, with her infant son. Madeline removed her shawl, wrapped it around the baby. No one asked. No one recorded it. It was simply human instinct. Between 1:30 and 1:55 a.m., lifeboat number 4 was ordered to be lowered. This boat was positioned on a lower deck near the gymnasium. Second Officer Charles Lighthaller supervised the loading. Windows on the enclosed promenade were opened. A narrow passage formed between the massive ship and the small boat waiting outside. Madeline's maid and nurse were helped through first. Then it was her turn. Jack Astor supported his wife, held her steady as she stepped through the opening. Madeline turned back to look at him. Jack leaned forward and asked one question. "May I go with my wife? She is pregnant," Lighthaller answered immediately. No. There was no negotiation. No explanation. Women and children only. Jack Astor did not argue. He did not give his name. He did not mention money. He did not invoke his position. He leaned down, kissed Madeline, told her he would find another boat, told her they would meet again in New York. Lifeboat number 4 began its descent toward the water. Madeline looked back up at the deck. Jack Astor stood there, alone. He turned away from the lifeboat and walked toward the darkness. Not because he could not buy a seat, but because for the first time in his life, money no longer held power. And the question that remained was this: what happens to a man when everything that once protected him stops working? The answer would come very soon. Titanic disappears beneath the surface of the sea. No more lights. No more music. No more engines. Only the cold, motionless Atlantic, and more than 1,500 people left drifting in the darkness. The water temperature is below freezing. Those without lifeboats have only minutes before their bodies stop responding. Jack Astor has no lifeboat. No one sees him after he turns away from the deck. No final words. No dramatic gesture. Only an empty space where he once stood. When morning comes, the survivors are taken aboard the Carpathia. Lists are made. Names are called. The name Jack Astor does not appear. Silence spreads faster than the news itself. New York wakes to a single question. Where was the richest man on the ship when it went down? In the days that follow, the press changes its tone. Articles that once criticized his marriage disappear. The mockery fades. In their place come different headlines about composure, about yielding his place to women and children, about refusing to use money or status to bend the rules. Society rejected him while he was alive, but in death, it accepts him as a symbol, April 22, 1912. The cable ship Mackay Bennett recovers body number 124, a man in a blue suit, brown shoes. More than $2,400 in cash in his pockets, a gold pen, diamond cufflinks, and a gold pocket watch engraved with 3 letters, JJA. The watch has stopped at 3:20 a.m., nearly an hour after Titanic sank, as if it continued counting time until the cold water finally reached it. The body is taken to Halifax. His son, Vincent Astor, comes to claim him. 20 years old, just lost his father. And suddenly one of the wealthiest men in America. May 4, 1912. The funeral is held in Rhinebeck, the place where Jack Astor lived, worked, and was known. No spectacle. No elaborate social ritual. Only family, friends, and a local community that knew him before the world assigned him titles. Jack Astor is buried beside his mother, Caroline Astor, the woman who controlled New York society for 4 decades. 2 generations of power lying side by side. One who built the social order. One who stepped outside it. But the Astor story does not end there. His death does not end his power. It transforms it. His name becomes a moral reference point for the upper class. A way to say that even the richest man can obey the rules. That even the greatest power has limits. And then his assets continue to shape the world. The hotels, the land, the trusts. Decisions written long before he ever stepped aboard Titanic. Astor died that night. But his influence did not. It merely changed form. And the final question remains. Does true power lie in what a person controls while alive, or in what continues to operate after they are gone? In 1912, while the echo of the Titanic disaster still filled newspaper columns, another document quietly surfaced. No spectacle, no emotion. Yet just as cold as the North Atlantic itself, it was the will of John Jacob Astor. Eve, not a farewell. A structure of power. The words had been written before he ever stepped aboard the ship, but they only began to act when he could no longer speak. At the time of his death, Astor's total estate was widely estimated at around $87 million in 1912 currency. In modern terms, that figure translates into several billion dollars today, a fortune large enough to suggest that even death could not end his influence. And it did not. But this is where the story turns. The will did not divide money by sentiment. It divided it by order. The largest portion of the estate went to Vincent Astor, the legitimate son from the first marriage, the heir who carried the Astor name in the form New York society recognized and understood: land, hotels, trusts, control over financial structures that had operated for decades. Vincent did not merely inherit wealth. He inherited the center of the empire. But that still does not explain the real tension. Because public attention quickly shifted to the woman who had stepped off a lifeboat, pregnant, and still only partially accepted by society. Madeline Astor. Under the terms of the will, Madeline received a direct cash payment of $100,000, small when set beside the total estate, yet equivalent to several $1 million today. Enough to live comfortably. Not enough to be truly independent. The more significant provisions were the ones not given outright. Madeline was granted the right to reside in Astor's Fifth Avenue mansion, not full ownership, the right to occupy, the right to remain visible within a space that had once been the center of New York's social power. And then there was the trust. $5 million. Using the same valuation framework, this amount would equal well over $100 million today. A sum large enough to secure a lifetime of financial safety. But this decision changed everything. The trust came with a single condition: precise and unforgiving. If Madeline remarried, it would all end. No moral argument, no emotional appeal, just one clause, and time would be the enforcer. At the same time, the will accounted for a life not yet born. On August 14, 1912, Madeline gave birth to John Jacob Astor IV. The press called him the Titanic baby. But within the architecture of power, he was not a symbol. He was a parallel line of inheritance, secured by law. Astor left him a separate trust of $3 million, a sum that translates into tens of millions today, a future defined before his first conscious memory. Then time began to activate the clauses. In 1916, Madeline remarried William Carl Dick, a childhood acquaintance. No grandeur, no public display. But that moment triggered everything that had been written in advance. The trust was revoked. The right to the Fifth Avenue house ended. The Astor name disappeared from her life. There was no dramatic courtroom battle. No exception. The will performed exactly as designed. And this is why the story cannot end with money. Astor died on the deck of the Titanic. Yet through these clauses, he continued to shape the lives of those who survived him. Not through emotion, not through persuasion, but through structure. And the question that remains is this: if a man can govern the future of others with a few lines written after his death, where does the true power of the Astor dynasty really lie? In the wealth they possessed, or in the way they made time itself continue to work on their behalf? In the end, everything returns to a single point. Not the ship, not the dynasty, but a small object that fits in the palm of a hand, the pocket watch of John Jacob Astor IV. After 1912, Vincent Astor kept the watch, not to display it, not to retell the story of the Titanic, but because it was tied to a moment the Astor family could not control and could not rewrite, a moment when money could not buy one more step forward, a moment when the Astor name, for the first time in generations, failed to open another door. In the years that followed, Vincent Astor did not build a public persona like his father. Instead, he restructured the entire empire. Dozens of hotels were folded into professional management systems. Manhattan land holdings were consolidated into long-term trusts. Wealth was no longer attached to a single man, but to legal frameworks, contracts, and cash flow. The Astor family entered a new form of power, less visible, less theatrical, but more stable, and far more enduring. And within that structure, the watch became unnecessary. In 1935, Vincent gave the watch to the Dobbin family. No press release, no formal record. The watch left the Astor family at the exact moment their power no longer depended on personal symbols. Nearly a century later, the watch returned. April 27, 2024. This time, it appeared under auction lights and sold for more than £1 million sterling. No one was buying gold. No one was buying craftsmanship. They were buying a frozen moment in history. 3:20 a.m., April 15, 1912. The moment when Jack Astor no longer controlled anything. He did not die poor. He did not die without power. He died at the precise boundary where personal power could go no further, even with an empire standing behind it. And that is why the watch still holds value today. Not because it once belonged to an Astor, but because it marks the rare point where a man's personal power ended and structures took over. The hotels kept operating. The land kept generating wealth. The trusts continued shaping lives across generations. Only the watch stopped. If this story leaves you wondering why some dynasties vanish with their founders while others continue as invisible systems, The videos appearing on your screen will take you deeper into that question. Thank you for staying until the very end. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to continue exploring stories about power, wealth, and what keeps moving long after people are gone, don't forget to like and subscribe. I see you in the next story.